The church door wasn't knocked on, it was pushed. I was turning off the last lights in the hall when I heard the wooden porch creak. It wasn't wind, it was weight, something far too large to be a coyote, too heavy to be a deer. The sound came again, not aggressive, just insistent, as if whatever was outside didn't want to come in. It simply couldn't stand anymore. I walked to the door with my heart pounding louder than it should for someone my age. I turned the handle slowly, and she was there, an adult tigress, massive, breathing fast. Vapor poured from her muzzle like white smoke in the mountain cold. Her belly was heavy, hanging too low to ignore. Pregnant, very close. She didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She just looked at me, not into my eyes, at my chest, as if she were assessing something beyond my shape. And then I heard in the distance a sound that doesn't belong to nature, a sharp gunshot, far away but real. She turned her head toward the forest, then back to me. That's when I understood. She hadn't come for shelter. She was running. The mountains around our small town had been reporting strange movements in recent weeks. Tracks where no tracks should be. Carcasses left without purpose. Illegal hunters. People who don't know the difference between survival and cruelty. She was looking for a place that wasn't obvious. Not forest, not den. And the church was the only lit building on that hillside. If this story already has you hooked, leave a like now, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I read many of them, and it helps the video reach more people around the world. She tried to take a step forward and failed. She didn't collapse completely, but her front paw slid on the wooden porch. Her breathing grew uneven. A subtle contraction ran through her body. I recognize that kind of tension. I've seen fires begin quietly before they explode, and that was the beginning of something inevitable. She wasn't just running, she was going into labor. Another gunshot echoed. Closer. She didn't run. She no longer had the strength to climb the mountain. Instead, she did something I will never forget as long as I live. She slowly lowered her body in front of the church door and stayed there. Not like a predator, not like a threat, but like someone choosing the last place left to trust. And I had less than 3 seconds to decide whether opening that door meant protecting the building or protecting the life about to begin right there. I opened the door just enough so the church's warmth wouldn't escape all at once. The cold air cut in like a blade, and I felt the skin on my face tighten. The tigress lifted her head slowly, as if every movement cost her. She didn't try to push past me. She just waited. Another shot cracked in the distance, muffled by trees and space, but close enough for the echo to bounce between the rocks. That erased any doubt I still had. This wasn't a lost hunter. It was people searching. I glanced down the narrow road that climbed the hill and saw, between the branches, a beam of light sweeping across the snow. A powerful flashlight, methodical movement. They were coming up. My body wanted to shut the door and pretend nothing existed. But the tigress took a deep breath and, with her heavy belly brushing the wood, dragged her paws forward, into the doorway, as if crossing an invisible border. I stepped back. The sound of claws against the old church floor sent a chill through me. Not because of threat, but because of reality. This was truly happening, right in front of the altar where I spent my nights straightening pews and extinguishing candles. She entered without hurry and without violence. As soon as her paws touched the stone floor near the entrance, she stopped and shifted slightly, positioning herself so she could see the door and the side corridor that led to the storage room. It was a mother's stance, not a predator's, and then the real contraction came. Her flank tightened, her already rapid breathing turned into effort, and the sound she released wasn't a roar. It was a low, heavy groan, as if her own body were asking for time. I froze with my hand still on the handle, listening. Another crack outside, not a gunshot this time, but a branch snapping. Footsteps. I closed the door carefully, too carefully to make noise, and locked it. The church wood wasn't strong. The lock was old, and suddenly I found myself trapped inside an aging building with a tigress, about to give birth, and armed men outside. I thought about calling the police, looked at my phone. No signal, of course. The hill always swallowed reception, as if the modern world had no authority up here. I had to hide her, and I had to do it without turning the church into a maze of panic. I went to the small side room where we kept donated blankets and old boxes. I grabbed 2 thick blankets and a tarp. The sound of fabric felt far too loud in the silence. When I returned, she had lain down near the first pew, in the shadows, but with her head pointed toward the door. Her eyes followed my every movement, alert but not aggressive. And then I saw the mark on her shoulder a pale shape, an irregular white patch that looked like snow caught in her fur, but wasn't. It was hers. My chest tightened with a memory I had buried for years. An accident on a state highway, long ago, when I still wore a uniform and my hands moved fast. An illegal transport truck overturned on an icy curve, men shouting, cages broken open, and a tiger cub curled in the corner, that same white patch on her shoulder, trembling in fear under the red siren lights. I had cut through metal with a saw, crawled into a tight space, draped my jacket over her to stop her from thrashing. I remembered her eyes, the way she sniffed my hand before pulling back. I never thought I would see that mark again. Outside, a voice shouted something, muffled by the door, but close enough to know they were near. Another flashlight swept across the side window, and the beam passed through the simple stained glass, painting the floor in a faint, trembling color. I turned off the last corridor light and left only 2 candles burning near the altar, low and partially hidden behind cloth so they wouldn't reveal movement. The tigress lifted her muzzle and drew in the air. She knew there were people. She knew that was real danger, and still she didn't try to flee, didn't try to break anything. She stayed because there was no more time. The contraction returned, longer now. She pressed her body against the floor, and her claws scraped against the stone. I knelt at a safe distance, close enough to help, far enough not to become a threat. The fear I felt was different from ordinary fear. It was a mixture of respect and responsibility. I wasn't a hero. I was simply the man available in that minute. And when the tigress turned her head toward me, I understood she hadn't come to that door by accident. She had searched for a place where human hands had once been the opposite of a trap. The first sign that labor had truly begun was her silence. She stopped groaning and began panting, as if saving every sound to conserve strength. Outside, I heard footsteps on the porch. The wood creaked, the same creak that had alerted me earlier. I held my breath. The handle moved, a light test, like someone checking if anyone was inside. I thought about shouting, about turning on every light, about pretending I was just an old caretaker. But then I looked at the tigress, at her heavy belly, at her eyes fixed on the door, and realized that any sound from me would be a sentence. I walked slowly to the small bell hanging on the inner side wall. Not the large one outside, but a simple bell we used to announce gatherings. I didn't ring it. Not yet. I just rested my hand on it and waited another second. The tigress held her breath and pushed her body against the floor, and I saw the wave of contraction travel through her entire frame. At the same time, the handle turned again, firmer now, and a man's irritated voice spoke close to the wood. "Anyone in there?" I didn't answer, because in that instant I understood the decision was no longer about opening or closing the door. It was about buying enough time for 2 lives to be born. Before the world outside realized the church had stopped being just a building, the handle stopped moving for a few seconds that felt like a full minute. I could hear the man's breathing on the other side, too close to the wood. The tigress didn't take her eyes off the door. Her body was tense, but not in attack posture. It was the tension of protection. Another contraction came, stronger, and she pressed her head against the cold floor, as if seeking strength from the stone itself. I took 2 slow steps back, not out of fear of her, but to avoid crossing the invisible line between help and threat. Outside, footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the church. A flashlight beam cut across the small storage window. They were looking for tracks in the snow. Tracking. I needed to erase any sign that led here. But it was too late. Her paw prints were on the porch, and maybe mine were too. The first life began there, in the heavy silence of the side corridor. There was no roar, no dramatic scene. There was effort, uneven breathing, and then a small sound, almost inaudible but powerful enough to pierce everything, a faint squeak. I saw the tiny body slide into the world, wrapped in warm vapor that contrasted with the cold church air. The tigress moved with absolute precision, cleaning, adjusting, nudging the cub toward her chest. I stayed where I was, kneeling, witnessing something I had no right to witness, yet she allowed me to see. Outside I heard a voice say, "The tracks lead here." My stomach tightened. The second shot of the night echoed, not aimed directly, but fired as a signal to the partner farther away. The tigress lifted her head at the sound of the shot, not to flee, to assess. The cub was moving, weak but alive. She didn't stand. She didn't try to defend by attacking. She chose to remain where she was, because the second cub had not yet come. And then I realized something that chilled me deeply. The scent, the smell of birth would begin to spread, and predators don't respect sacred walls. If the hunters didn't enter, other animals might approach. The church, which had always sheltered lost people, now sheltered something the entire forest could sense. I rose slowly and walked to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood. 2 men. One of them laughed quietly, like someone who believes he's already found what he came for. The second contraction was more violent. She pressed her body into the floor and let out a short, deep sound. I hurried back to her side. The second cub took longer, long enough for someone outside to pound hard on the door. The wood vibrated. The tigress turned her face toward me for a second, and in that look there was no plea for help. There was decision. If they entered, she would attack, even exhausted, even with newborns, and she would die inside that church if necessary. I knew it with absolute clarity. I also knew that if that happened, the story would end there. No miracle, no witness. That was when I did the only thing that could change the outcome without triggering direct confrontation. I walked to the large exterior church bell. The rope ran through the ceiling into the main hall. I gripped it, looked one last time at the tigress, who at that exact moment pushed with every ounce of strength she had left. The second cub was born in silence, and I pulled the bell. The sound exploded across the mountain, echoing between rocks and rolling down toward the small town in the valley. It wasn't a routine call. It was long, insistent, urgent. The kind of ringing that makes people step outside, even in the cold. Outside, I heard the men curse. One ran across the porch. The other muttered something about people coming. Headlights began to appear on the road below, small beams climbing the hill. I released the rope and felt the silence return, different from before. It was no longer the silence of threat. It was the silence of a turning point. Headlights began climbing the hill one by one, as if the mountain itself were lighting eyes in the darkness. I heard car doors slamming below, confused voices asking why the bell was ringing at that hour. Outside the church, the hurried footsteps changed rhythm. They were no longer confident. They were nervous. One of them kicked the door in frustration, but didn't persist. The presence of witnesses turns cruel courage into quick cowardice. Through the narrow gap beneath the wood, I saw shadows pulling away from the porch and slipping along the side of the building. They didn't want to be seen there, and for the first, in time since I opened that door, I felt that maybe the night wouldn't end in confrontation. I turned back to the tigress. The 2 cubs were pressed against her body, still damp, too small to understand the world they had just entered. The first was already moving more firmly, searching for warmth. The second was too quiet, not motionless, just slow. The tigress began cleaning him more insistently, nudging with her muzzle, stimulating. I remained kneeling, attentive. She did not see me as a threat. I knew that because when I stepped half a pace closer, she didn't bare her teeth. She only followed me with her eyes, as if allowing, but not delegating. It was a fine line. I could help, but I could not replace her. Outside, the town's voices grew closer. Someone called my name. "Pastor, is everything all right?" I didn't answer. Immediately, if they opened the door at that moment, panic would do the rest. A tigress with 2 newborn cubs inside the church is not an image. A small community processes calmly. I walked to the door and spoke loud enough to be heard, but not alarming. "Everything's under control, just a problem with the bell. A small lie to protect something greater." The men who had been there before were already gone. I could hear the engine of a vehicle starting in the distance, descending the frozen road too fast. When I returned to her, the tigress lifted her head and looked at me differently. There was no longer urgency to flee in her eyes. There was calculation, assessment. She was deciding whether this place was still safe or whether she needed to move the cubs before full daylight. The second cub finally released a faint sound, a fragile squeak in the cold air. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The tigress brought her muzzle briefly to my arm. Not a lingering touch, not submission, just a precise, fleeting contact. The same shoulder that years ago had supported a trembling cub under siren lights. Memory is not exclusive to humans. In that touch, there was recognition, not debt. The sky began to lighten behind the simple, stained glass windows bathing the interior in pale blue. The community was gathered outside, speaking in low voices, curious but respecting my request to keep their distance. I knew that collective protection, even unconscious, had saved 3 lives that dawn. The tigress slowly rose. The movement was heavy but steady. She lifted the first cub gently and positioned him closer against her body. Then she did the same. With the second, she looked at the door, looked at me. There was no rush now. There was choice. And I understood that the next moment would determine whether that connection ended there or crossed the mountain with them. I walked to the door and opened it just enough to look at the slope. The townspeople were scattered across the yard, some still in pajamas under heavy coats, trying to understand the reason for the urgent bell on that freezing dawn. I raised my hand, asking for silence, and stepped 2 stairs down from the porch. "It's all right. Go back home. False alarm." They hesitated. In a small town, curiosity is almost a duty, but so is trust. And after a few tense seconds, they began to disperse. Headlights went dark, doors shut. The hill returned to its usual silence. Only now it carried something that could never be. Explained in simple words. When I went back inside, she was standing, both cubs pressed against her chest, protected by a body still exhausted, but steady. The blue light of dawn streamed through the simple stained glass, touching her fur with an almost solemn glow. The white patch on her shoulder seemed brighter in that light. She walked toward me in 2 slow steps. I did not step back. I did not move forward. We stood face to face in the church's central aisle, where so many times I had preached about trust without ever imagining I would live such a literal version of it. She tilted her head slightly, not in submission, in recognition. The first cub shifted, searching for warmth. The second let out a faint but steady sound. She was ready to leave. Something tightened in my chest. Not fear, not relief. It was the awareness that this moment would never repeat itself the same way again. I had opened the door for a life to begin, and now I needed to open it again, to let it continue. I pushed the door open slowly. The cold air entered, but it was no longer a threat. It was a path. She passed by me without touching, but close enough for me to feel the warmth of her body for a second. On the porch, she paused, looked toward the mountain, then looked back at me. It was a long look, unhurried, without urgency, the kind of gaze that closes old cycles, the same one I had seen years ago under siren lights, when a cub trapped between twisted metal decided that my hand was not the enemy. She descended the slope with the 2 cubs, disappearing among the snow-covered pines. I remained standing until the stripes became nothing more than movement between shadows. The church felt larger and smaller at the same time, larger for having been a refuge, smaller for having witnessed something that required no audience. I thought that was the end of the story, but it wasn't. Months passed. The snow melted. The town returned to its ordinary rhythm of quiet Sundays and open windows. Little by little, the dawn of the bell became a quiet legend. I never told the full version. Those who asked about the urgent ringing received simple answers. The truth was too heavy to become coffee talk. At the beginning of summer, we organized an outdoor service on the hillside behind the church. Children running, folding chairs scattered across the grass, simple music echoing through the valley. I was in the middle of a reading when something caused the voices to fade one by one. It wasn't noise, it was presence. At the top of the hill, where the line of pines meets the sky, she appeared, stronger, steadier, and she was not alone. 2 cubs walked beside her, larger now, their steps unsteady but determined. They were not hiding, they were not running. They were there, visible to everyone. The entire town saw, and no one moved. She stopped exactly where the mountain begins to rise more steeply. The wind lifted her. Ever slightly. One of the cubs looked curiously toward the valley. The other stayed close to her. She turned her head in my direction. Even from that distance, I recognized the same gaze from that dawn. It wasn't display. It wasn't challenge. It was confirmation. I opened my hand at my side, the same gesture I had made years earlier when a frightened cub needed to decide whether to trust. She held my gaze for a few seconds. Then she turned and walked up the mountain with the two beside her. When they disappeared among the trees, no one spoke for almost a full minute. There was no applause, no shouting, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't weigh, it fills. And there, in front of the entire town, I understood that the story had never been about a miracle. It was about choice. In two different moments of life, I stood between her and danger, and in both, she chose to trust. If this story touched you in any way, write in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Leave a like if you believe compassion crosses species. And subscribe to the channel, because sometimes, when the bell rings, it isn't only the church calling. It's life asking someone to open the door.